When Olivia first woke up that chilly November morning, she never imagined her life was about to whisper a secret. She wasn't ready to hear a secret that showed up quietly in the ordinary moments. She always ignored moments that suddenly felt heavier, softer, and strangely meaningful. As if her own body had decided to speak in a language she hadn't yet learned to understand. She sat on the edge of her bed, rubbing her eyes, wondering why she felt both exhausted and wired at the same time, why her breath felt a little fuller, why her chest felt a hint of soreness that hadn't been there the night before. And as sunlight slipped through the window blinds, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, her body was trying to say something that her mind hadn't caught up to yet. Because the truth is, common pregnancy symptoms rarely introduce themselves with drama or certainty. They come like soft footsteps, like gentle nudges that whisper instead of shout. And Olivia remembered just last week when she felt a wave of nausea on her way to work, a sudden twist in her stomach that made her pull over for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and breathing slowly as she told herself it must be leftover sushi or maybe stress from another long shift at the hospital. But now, sitting here with that persistent tenderness in her breast and a fatigue that didn't match the amount of sleep she had gotten, she felt a quiet tug inside her, like her intuition clearing its throat, preparing to speak. She stretched her legs, feeling a heaviness that didn't belong to simple tiredness, and as she walked to the kitchen in her fuzzy socks, she noticed how the smell of coffee, her favorite smell in the world, suddenly made her stomach tighten in the strangest way, and she froze, fingers gripping the counter because this wasn't normal, not for her, not ever. And she reached for a glass of water instead, sipping slowly, trying to hide from a possibility she wasn't sure if she was ready to face. And yet her mind kept drifting back to the symptoms she'd heard about in passing, from her patients, from friends, from videos she'd watched without thinking much about them. Nausea, breast tenderness, fatigue, sensitivity to smells, mood swings that come like unexpected weather, a missed period that suddenly feels louder than any symptom combined. And as she stood there in the quiet kitchen, her heart thudding softly, she remembered how last night she snapped at Noah over something small, something as silly as where he placed the car keys, and then cried minutes later, apologizing into his shirt while he wrapped his arms around her with that gentle patience she adored. And now she felt that same wave of emotion rising again, but this time it wasn't sadness or frustration, it was fear, wonder, hope, confusion, all tangled into one breath. She ran her fingers through her hair, remembering the moment she'd opened her calendar app 2 days ago, scrolling back and forth, realizing her period was late, not by much, but enough to plant a seed of suspicion. And her mind replayed every change she'd felt in her body these past 2 weeks, every symptom that seemed like it could mean something or nothing depending on how she looked at it. Because early pregnancy symptoms are rarely neat, they overlap with PMS, stress, exhaustion, everyday life, and yet somehow feel different, deeper, almost purposeful. And Olivia felt a lump in her throat as she whispered to herself, "Is it possible?" Not loudly, not confidently, but with the fragile tremble of someone afraid to hope too soon. She walked toward the living room, hugging herself as she sank into the couch, staring at the ceiling as if the universe might give her a hint. And she found herself thinking about every woman who had ever sat like this, unsure, searching the signs, feeling her body shift in ways that didn't make sense at first, but slowly formed a picture, a possibility, a beginning. And despite the swirl of anxiety in her chest, she felt a warmth spread through her, a gentle swell of something indescribably beautiful. Because even though she didn't have answers yet, even though she didn't know for certain what these symptoms meant, she understood one thing clearly: her body was trying to guide her, to tell her its own story, one symptom at a time. And deep inside, beneath all the confusion and fear, she felt a tiny thread of courage pulling her forward, urging her to listen, to pay attention, to trust the subtle signs that something extraordinary might be unfolding. And with a slow, shaky breath, Olivia closed her eyes and placed a hand on her belly, not because she knew for sure, but because in that quiet moment, it felt like the right thing to do, like the beginning of understanding not just the symptoms, but the possibility of life gently growing within her. Olivia stayed on the couch longer than she intended, her fingers gently tracing little circles over her sweatshirt, as if her body might answer her questions through touch alone. And while the morning remained quiet, her thoughts grew louder, carrying memories of the past few days like a reel. She couldn't pause, moments she had overlooked, moments that suddenly made sense now that she was connecting them to the possibility that she might be pregnant. She remembered how she had woken up 2 mornings in a row feeling strangely bloated, not in a painful way, but in a way she couldn't explain, a heaviness low in her belly that came and went, and how she had brushed it off as something she ate, or maybe water retention from the salty dinner she and Noah had enjoyed. But now she realized it wasn't just bloating. It was that subtle shift women describe when their bodies begin adjusting to the earliest stages of pregnancy. That almost indescribable feeling of fullness that comes before the obvious signs, and it made her heart flutter with nervous anticipation. She leaned back thinking of the night she had been brushing her teeth and suddenly had to stop because a wave of dizziness washed over her, making her grip the sink and steady herself while she waited for the room to stop spinning. And she had laughed it off at the time, joking to Noah that she must be dehydrated or just exhausted from her shift. But now that memory hit differently, heavier, more meaningful, as if her body had been trying to whisper to her before she was ready to listen. She sighed deeply, trying to organize her emotions. Because understanding common pregnancy symptoms wasn't just about listing them, it was about recognizing how they blended into her daily routines, how they hid inside regular moments, how they didn't announce themselves dramatically but instead arrived gently, quietly, like soft footsteps in the hallway of her life. And she felt a strange comfort in realizing she wasn't alone. That millions of women had sat exactly where she was now, analyzing the same symptoms, wrestling with the same mix of hope and uncertainty. And that thought made her feel connected to something bigger than her own experience. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and let her mind wander to the most confusing symptom of all, her emotions, the wide swings that had left her feeling like a stranger in her own skin. Because one moment she felt deeply sensitive, crying over an ad featuring puppies, and the next moment she felt irritable, snapping over small things she usually ignored. And she remembered standing in the kitchen 2 days ago, stirring pasta sauce while tears rolled down her cheeks for no reason she could explain, her emotions bubbling like water in a pot, rising and falling unpredictably. And she had been embarrassed at first, but Noah had cupped her face and kissed her forehead, telling her she didn't have to explain what she was feeling, just to let herself feel it. And that moment of tenderness replayed in her mind now with a new layer of understanding, because mood swings, she knew, were one of the earliest and most common pregnancy symptoms caused by hormonal changes that begin long before a missed period. And she felt a tightness in her chest at the realization that her body might truly be shifting, transforming, preparing for something she hadn't dared to imagine. She pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them as she recalled another moment she had brushed off, her sudden craving for something sweet late at night. A craving so strong she had driven to the gas station in her pajamas just to buy chocolate milk and pretzels, and she had laughed about it then, calling it a random craving. But now she couldn't help but wonder if her body had been signaling something deeper, something miraculous. Because cravings weren't just random, they were often among the first subtle changes as hormones began adjusting to support a new life, and the thought made her breath hitch a little. She found herself imagining a tiny spark of life smaller than a grain of sand already causing waves inside her body, already shifting her emotions, her energy, her senses, and the image felt unreal, yet overwhelmingly beautiful. She pressed the blanket closer as the morning light brightened across the room, and she felt a wave of warmth wash over her, not the warmth of certainty but the warmth of possibility, the kind that makes your heart race in the gentlest way. And for the first time that morning, she allowed herself to smile at the thought, even if it was fragile, even if she wasn't sure yet, because there was something incredible about hearing the story her body might be trying to tell her. She knew she wasn't ready to take a test just yet. She wanted to understand her symptoms fully, to listen to each one carefully, to give herself the space to process everything she felt physically and emotionally, because pregnancy wasn't just a biological change, it was a life change, a shift in identity, a doorway into a new chapter, and she wanted to walk toward it slowly, intentionally, with awareness. She reached for her phone, opening a notes app where she began typing each symptom she remembered: fatigue, nausea, breast tenderness, emotional swing, sensitivity to smells, mild bloating, slight dizziness, cravings, missed period. And seeing them listed one after another made her chest tighten with a mix of fear and awe, because now they formed a pattern, a picture, a story her body had been telling for days. And as she read them back to herself, she felt something inside her soften, a tenderness blooming deep within. Because whether the journey ahead confirmed her hopes or led her somewhere else, she realized she was strong enough to face it, patient enough to wait, and hopeful enough to dream. Olivia set her phone down beside her heart thumping a soft rhythmic beat that felt heavier than usual, not in a scary way but in a way that made her acutely aware of every thought passing through her mind, every signal rising from her body. And as she tucked the blanket tighter around herself, she thought back to the night when she first noticed something was off. She had been brushing her hair in the bathroom, humming absent-mindedly when she caught her reflection in the mirror and paused, noticing her skin looked a little different. Not worse, not tired, just different, as though a subtle glow had formed without her permission, the kind of glow people talk about but never fully explain. And she had leaned closer, studying herself, wondering if she was imagining it, or if something sacred and unfamiliar was beginning inside her. She remembered how her lower back had been aching more than usual, a dull, persistent ache that she associated with long shifts or restless nights. But now, wrapped in that quiet morning stillness, she found herself replaying that sensation, realizing it had been consistent for days, coming and going like a tide she didn't notice at first. And as she thought about it, she understood that early pregnancy often announces itself through these gentle aches, these subtle tugs in the body that feel like preparation, like reshaping, like a quiet beginning unfolding beneath the surface. And that realization wrapped around her heart like a warm hand. She closed her eyes and remembered another symptom she'd dismissed: frequent trips to the bathroom, something she had blamed on drinking more water lately. But when she replayed those moments now, she recognized the pattern, how progesterone in early pregnancy often caused increased urination, how the body worked overtime to support something new even before a woman knew for sure. And she felt her breath catch at the idea that her body might have been supporting a new life long before her mind began to suspect it. She shifted on the couch, pressing a hand to her lower belly as if instinctively drawn to the place where her questions bloomed. And she whispered softly to herself, not as a confirmation but as a wondering, a searching what if. A question that held hope and fear in equal measure. A question that cracked open a door to a future she wasn't sure she was ready to step into but couldn't stop imagining. She thought about the heaviness she'd felt in her legs lately, the odd sense of tiredness that didn't match the sleep she'd gotten, and how she had brushed it off as simply being worn out from work. But now, as she pieced each symptom together, it felt like she was assembling a puzzle she hadn't meant to start, a puzzle whose picture was becoming clearer, and with every piece she remembered, her heart fluttered with something new, something close to wonder. She curled her legs beneath her, recalling the moment when she had suddenly felt overheated despite the cold weather, a surprising warmth that spread across her chest and neck, making her remove her sweater even though she had been freezing minutes before, and she had laughed it off thinking she was getting sick. But now she realized fluctuating body temperature was another early symptom women often experienced, and the memory made her chest tighten with emotional pressure she wasn't ready to release. She remembered sitting on the edge of her bed 2 nights ago, legs dangling, feeling faintly lightheaded for no reason, a brief sensation that made her pause but didn't last long enough to scare her. And now she wondered if it had been part of this quiet, unfolding story her body was trying to tell. A story she hadn't had the courage to see until now. Her fingers trembled slightly as she thought about how her appetite had shifted, how some foods she normally loved now seemed unappealing, and how others, especially cold fruits and salty snacks, suddenly felt irresistible. And she smiled faintly, remembering how she had eaten almost an entire bowl of strawberries at midnight even though she rarely snacked that late. And the realization made her cheeks warm with a mix of embarrassment and affection for herself. She thought about her sudden aversion to strong perfumes, how she had gently pushed away a scented candle Noah loved because it made her stomach twist unexpectedly, and she remembered how he teased her about being overly sensitive, brushing her hair back and kissing her cheek, not knowing that her sensitivity might have been her body's reaction to shifting hormones that were preparing her for something incredible. She pressed her forehead against her knees, letting the weight of everything settle around her like a soft fog, not heavy, not suffocating, but present, real, undeniable. And in that stillness, she allowed herself to imagine what these symptoms might mean if they truly pointed toward pregnancy: the long nights, the tender moments, the quiet fears, the overwhelming joy, the changes her body would go through, the future she might be stepping into without realizing it. And the thought made her eyes sting with tears that weren't sadness or fear but something gentler, something sacred. She thought of Noah, of the way he had always looked at her with steady eyes, the way he talked about the future with hope that wrapped around her like safety. And she wondered how he would react if she told him what she suspected, if he would smile with that soft, slow smile he had when he was overwhelmed with happiness, or if he would hold her close like he did when he sensed she needed comfort. And the thought made her heart ache with tenderness. She took a deep breath, letting her symptoms replay in her mind like a quiet song: breast tenderness, nausea, fatigue, emotional swings, heightened smells, cravings, bloating, slight dizziness, backache, frequent urination, missed period, and for the first time, she didn't try to brush them off or justify them as coincidence. Instead, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they might mean, the possibility that these symptoms weren't random but woven together with purpose. And with her hand resting gently on her belly, she felt a calmness settle over her, a soft acceptance that whatever happened next, she would face it with courage, with hope, with love. Olivia slowly lifted her head from her knees, wiping a tear from her cheek even though she couldn't tell if it had fallen from fear, relief, or the quiet emotional overwhelm that had wrapped around her all morning. And as she let out a shaky breath, she stared at the soft patterns on the living room rug, watching the sunlight stretch across it like a warm hand reaching in her direction. And she thought about how strange it was that her life could feel so normal and extraordinary at the same time, how she could be sitting in the same spot, wrapped in the same blanket, surrounded by the same quiet walls, yet feel like her entire world was tilting toward a new horizon. She shifted her weight, feeling the persistent heaviness in her lower belly again, and this time she didn't brush it aside or blame it on stress. Instead, she tried to connect with it, to understand it, to treat it like the gentle whisper of a body trying to speak to her. And she realized how easy it was for women to ignore these signs, to push them down in the rush of everyday routines. But now that she was listening, really listening, every sensation felt louder, clearer, more intentional. She remembered the moment earlier in the week when she had been walking up the stairs and suddenly felt out of breath halfway up, something that never happened to her, because she was usually energetic, always moving, always physically active. And she had paused mid-step, gripping the railing, telling herself she must be tired from work. But now she could still remember how her lungs felt heavier than usual, how her body seemed to require more oxygen, something she later realized was incredibly common in early pregnancy, as the body began increasing blood flow and adjusting to new hormonal demands. And as that memory surfaced, she felt a deep sense of arise within her, because her body might have been preparing for something miraculous long before her mind was ready to even consider it. As she pulled the blanket closer, she found herself thinking of the slight metallic taste she had been experiencing in her mouth, something so subtle she had barely noticed it. Yet she recalled complaining about it to Noah while they ate dinner earlier that week, joking that the food tasted a bit off, even though he said it tasted perfectly fine. And now she understood that a metallic taste was one of those strange but common early pregnancy symptoms she'd only heard about in passing. The kind of symptom that made sense only when looked at in hindsight, and the realization sent a small shiver down her spine. She began piecing together moments she had forgotten, like the sudden tenderness in her gums when she brushed her teeth 2 nights ago, or how her sense of time and routine had started to feel slightly distorted, as though her mind wasn't syncing with her body the way it usually did. And she remembered waking up unusually early the other day without an alarm, lying in bed staring at the ceiling with a strange sense of awareness she couldn't explain, the kind that made her feel like she wasn't quite the same version of herself she had been before. And she wondered if these were all the little signals people talked about without fully understanding them. She leaned back against the couch cushions, the memory of her vivid dreams slipping into her thoughts, the kind of dreams that felt too real, too colorful, too emotionally charged. The dreams where she woke up with her heart racing and a feeling lingering in her chest that stayed long after her eyes opened. And she remembered how Noah had teased her for describing every detail of her dream one morning, saying she'd never sounded so passionate about anything at 7 in the morning before. But now she realized that vivid dreams were also a common early pregnancy symptom, fueled by shifting hormones that deepened emotional awareness even during sleep. And the thought made her smile faintly through the swirl of everything she was feeling. Her mind flashed back to the way she had been more forgetful lately, misplacing her keys, leaving the refrigerator door slightly open, forgetting the end of a conversation she had begun, and she had chalked it up to being overwhelmed. But now she wondered if pregnancy brain, even in its earliest form, had begun to make subtle appearances in her life without her noticing. And she found herself whispering, "How did I miss all this?" Not in a self-critical way, but in a tone filled with gentle amazement. Because the signs had been there, tiny breadcrumbs leading her toward the truth she was only just beginning to face. She hugged the blanket tighter as a swell of tenderness expanded in her chest. Thinking about how many women before her had experienced the same confusion, the same mix of symptoms that could be mistaken for stress or exhaustion or hormonal fluctuation, and she felt a sudden wave of empathy rise inside her. A connection to every woman who had felt these changes without knowing exactly what they meant. And she realized how remarkable it was that the human body could communicate so much through such delicate signals. Like a secret language shared only between a woman and her own body, a language she had never learned, but was beginning to understand. Instinctively, she closed her eyes, imagining what might be happening inside her if she truly was pregnant, cells dividing, hormones rising, her body adjusting in microscopic ways that echoed into every symptom she felt, and the thought filled her with a sense of wonder so powerful it made her throat tighten and her eyes warm again. With emotion, she took a slow breath and whispered to herself, "I'm scared, but I'm ready." And as those words slipped out, she felt a surprising peace settle over her, not because she was certain, not because she had all the answers, but because acknowledging her emotions made everything feel more real, more manageable, more grounded. She rested her hand gently on her belly, feeling an odd flicker of protectiveness she didn't fully understand yet. And in that moment, she realized that whether or not she was truly pregnant, her symptoms were teaching her something important, something about awareness, intuition, vulnerability, courage, and the incredible strength that grows quietly inside a woman even before she steps into motherhood. And that realization alone felt like a small transformation, a shift in her heart she couldn't ignore. As Olivia continued to sit quietly wrapped in the familiar softness of her blanket, she felt her thoughts drift through every tiny detail of her recent days, as though her mind were gently rewinding her life and showing her each moment that now carried new meaning, and she let those memories wash over her, each one deepening the possibility that her body had been trying to communicate far earlier than she had realized. She remembered how unusually thirsty she had been, constantly reaching for her water bottle throughout the day, never feeling quite satisfied no matter how much she drank. And thinking back, she realized that increased thirst could also be linked to early pregnancy. Something she hadn't known at the time but now found herself recognizing with a flutter of nervous excitement. She recalled sitting at work feeling a wave of warmth spread across her skin even though the hospital hallways had been cold as always, and she had fanned herself with a patient chart while joking with a coworker about feeling randomly overheated. But now, as she replayed it, she saw another piece of the puzzle falling into place, another quiet symptom she hadn't taken seriously, and she felt her pulse quicken at the thought that her body might have been gently preparing her for a new chapter all along. She shifted her position, her hand instinctively resting against her belly as she remembered how emotional she'd become over the smallest things, like the little girl in the waiting room who had smiled shyly at her, or the elderly man who had thanked her for adjusting his blanket, or the moment she watched a mother soothe her crying toddler with a patience that made her heart ache unexpectedly. And she had brushed off those emotional waves as simply being tired or perhaps hormonal from her cycle. But now, with everything she knew, she realized that heightened sensitivity was among the most common early pregnancy symptoms, the kind that often appeared before a woman even noticed physical changes. And that thought stirred something warm and vulnerable inside her. She let her head rest back against the couch cushion as her mind drifted to the persistent feeling of fullness low in her abdomen, the soft, heavy sensation she had felt every morning for nearly a week. A sensation she had dismissed as menstrual cramps approaching, yet now she could see how different it had felt: less sharp, less predictable, more like a gentle pressure humming quietly beneath the surface. And she realized that early pregnancy often came with that same feeling, a slight stretching, a sense of the body preparing, adjusting, shifting to make room for something beautiful and new. She breathed slowly through her nose, remembering how she had been unusually tired late in the afternoons, the kind of tiredness that made her eyelids heavy even when she hadn't done anything particularly exhausting. And she recalled sitting at her desk one afternoon, trying to finish paperwork, but finding herself drifting off, her thoughts hazy, her energy drained. And even though she'd managed to push through, she now understood that early pregnancy fatigue wasn't like regular tiredness. It was deeper, heavier, rooted in hormones that surged quietly through the body in preparation for supporting new life. And thinking about that made her chest swell with a mix of awe and fear. She let out a shaky laugh. remembering how she had woken up craving lemonade one morning, even though she rarely drank it, and how she had made Noah stop at a cafe later that week because she desperately needed a cold smoothie even though she could be waited, and she thought about how early pregnancy cravings could be so subtle, so easily dismissed as random impulses, yet they often carried a deeper meaning when looked at together with everything else. And the memory made her smile softly despite the whirlwind inside her. She closed her eyes and allowed her thoughts to drift to the moment she had looked at her calendar and realized her period was late. The moment that had planted the seed of suspicion she was now fully exploring. The moment she felt her stomach drop, not out of fear, but out of the sudden clarity that her symptoms might not be random after all. And she remembered how she had sat on the edge of the bed for several minutes, just staring at the date, her breath shallow, her heart pounding as though her body knew something her mind hadn't caught up to yet, and that memory alone made her throat tighten with the same mixture of hope and uncertainty she felt. Now, she ran her hands through her hair, replaying every conversation she'd had with Noah over the past few weeks, every moment she'd found herself laughing more deeply, crying more quickly, feeling more connected to him in a way she couldn't explain. And she wondered if her body had been shifting emotionally in harmony with her physical symptoms, preparing her heart for what might come next. And that realization felt both terrifying and beautiful. She pressed her palm lightly against her chest, feeling her heartbeat steadying itself as she thought about how pregnancy symptoms were not just physical markers, but emotional ones too. And she reflected on how many women described the early days as a time when intuition felt stronger, when their bodies felt different, even before tests confirmed anything. And she realized that deep down, beneath all her logical thoughts and medical knowledge, there had been a small voice inside her, whispering possibilities long before she acknowledged them. She felt a gentle hum of reassurance inside her as she imagined how her symptoms might be telling the earliest chapter of a story she had never fully allowed herself to hope for. And she realized that whether she was truly pregnant or not, she had already begun to transform, already begun to see her body with a new compassion, a new curiosity, a new sense of partnership. And she knew that this awareness alone made her stronger, more connected, more grounded. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the weight and wonder of everything settle within her. And as she opened her eyes to the quiet living room, she felt something shift inside her, not certainty, not yet, but readiness, a quiet courage that made her whisper to herself, "Whatever happens, I can handle it," and she believed it with a sincerity that surprised her. Because in listening to her symptoms, she had begun listening to herself in a way she never had before. The early afternoon light shifted gently across the living room as Olivia finally rose from the couch, her blanket slipping off her shoulders and pooling softly at her feet. And for a moment she stood completely still, feeling the quiet thrum of her heartbeat in her chest, feeling the delicate awareness that had been building inside her all morning. And as she took a slow breath, she felt as though she were standing on the edge of something sacred, something she couldn't see yet but could somehow feel, a new chapter forming quietly beneath the surface of her life. She walked toward the window, pressing her fingertips lightly to the cool glass, watching the soft breeze ripple through the trees outside. And she thought about how strange and beautiful it was that life could change without warning, that tiny signs could whisper louder than any spoken words, that symptoms she had once ignored could now feel like pieces of a story she was finally brave enough to read. She wrapped her arms around herself, recalling each symptom once more, not out of fear this time, but with a growing sense of understanding, almost gratitude, because her body had been trying to guide her gently, patiently, offering clue after clue. The fatigue, the nausea, the heightened sense of smell, the tender breaths, the mood swings, the dizziness, the cravings, the bloating, the sensitivity, the emotional vulnerability, the subtle aches, the warmth, the strange dreams, the late period. And now, standing there in the warm hush of afternoon, she felt a deep appreciation for the quiet wisdom woven into each of those moments. She closed her eyes, imagining her body as something more than just bone and blood and breath, imagining it as a partner, a guide, a storyteller. And she felt a surprising comfort in that thought, because even though she still didn't know the truth with certainty, her symptoms had given her the strength to acknowledge what she felt inside, the possibility that she might be carrying new life, that something extraordinary could be growing within her. And she let that idea fill her gently until her chest felt warm and full and tender all at once. She turned away from the window and walked slowly toward her bedroom, each step heavier with the weight of her emotions. but also lighter, with a new sense of direction. And as she entered the quiet room, she felt her breath catch when she saw the small drawer by her nightstand, the drawer where she kept a single unopened pregnancy test she had bought months ago just in case. And even though she had forgotten about it until now, the memory hit her with a tidal wave of emotion. She knelt beside the drawer slowly, her hands trembling as she reached out and pulled it open, and seeing the small box there made her heart pound in her chest with a rhythm she couldn't control, a rhythm fueled by fear, hope, love, uncertainty, and a quiet courage she hadn't known she possessed. She held the box in her hands, feeling its surprising weight, feeling the gravity of every possibility it represented. And in that moment she thought of every woman who had ever held a test like this, every woman who had stood at the edge of this same moment, balancing between fear and hope, between what was and what might be, and she felt connected to them all in a deep, invisible way. She sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing the edges of the box as her breath shook with anticipation, and she allowed herself to imagine both outcomes: the joy of seeing two lines, the clarity of seeing one, the relief of finally knowing, the strength she'd need either way. And she reminded herself that no matter what, knowing the truth was better than letting uncertainty twist her heart into knots. She placed a hand on her belly again, this time with a tenderness that made her eyes blur with tears, and she whispered softly, "If you're there, I'm ready." Not because she felt fully prepared for motherhood, not because she had all the answers, but because the possibility alone had already transformed her in ways she couldn't explain, had already awakened something fierce and gentle and incredibly strong inside her. She stood slowly, holding the test as though it were something precious, and she walked toward the bathroom with careful steps, knowing that whatever happened next would change the shape of her day, maybe even the shape of her entire life. She flicked on the light, the soft hum of the fan filling the silence as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, her eyes bright with emotion, her cheeks flushed, her breath trembling, and for the first time, she saw the quiet strength she had felt growing inside her throughout the morning, a strength that came from listening to her body, trusting her intuition, acknowledging her symptoms, and holding space for possibility. She opened the box with slow, deliberate movements, her hands shaking not with fear, but with a deep, earnest vulnerability. And she followed each step carefully, her heart pounding louder with every passing second. As she waited, time seemed to slow, stretching out like a thread pulled too thin, wrapped in silence and anticipation and the echo of every symptom that had led her to this moment. And she felt herself sway slightly, grounding her feet to the floor as she whispered, "Whatever it is, I'll be okay," because she knew deep down that the strength she had felt all morning wasn't fleeting, it was hers, it was real, and it would carry her through whatever came next. When the test finally finished processing, she held it in her hands for a moment before daring to look, breathing in deeply as though gathering courage from the very air around her. And in that fragile, suspended instant, she realized that the journey wasn't just about confirming pregnancy, it was about understanding her body, honoring her symptoms, embracing her emotions, and discovering a resilience she never knew she had. And as she finally exhaled and lifted her eyes toward the result, her world shifted, softened, opened in a way she would remember for the rest of her life, marking the end of uncertainty and the beginning of whatever story awaited her next.